Welcome to our broadcast. Tonight, a follow-up to the CIA Guatemala story, which we covered in an earlier broadcast. Also this evening, from CBS Sports, Jim Nantz joins us from Seattle with a look at the upcoming NCAA Final Four. We'll have a conversation with brilliant architect Frank Israel. This program note, Tony Schwartz was to be here this evening for a discussion of his book, What Really Matters. Tony will join us next week for a conversation about the journey that he took in search of meaning and wisdom. We began this evening with the story of Guatemala and the CIA connection. Secretary of State Warren Christopher has announced that neither he nor President Clinton were aware of any CIA connection to a Guatemalan accused of murdering an American innkeeper and a guerrilla fighter who was married to an American woman. In Washington, Eliot Abrams joins us. Also, Robert Torricelli is here. The congressman joins us along with Allan Nairn of The Nation magazine as we begin this part of our follow-up to the CIA Guatemala story. You'll all remember that we had some conversation about this with Jennifer Harberry and others a week ago. I began with Congressman Torricelli. Thank you for coming. Elliot, thank you for coming. Allen, good to have you here. Did Secretary of State Christopher say to you, and a question from you, that he did not know if the CIA was continuing to fund Guatemalan military officials?
I found, Charlie, in my years in Washington to be the most extraordinary answer. I asked whether indeed the Secretary of State of our country knew, now that the United States has further suspended military assistance to Guatemala, whether or not there was a covert program by the intelligence community to fund the Guatemalan military. He chose his words very carefully, and it was very clear. He doesn't know.
How is that possible, that knowing what questions he would face, he wouldn't be able to, with the president's authority, find out?
Oh, I think President Clinton's going to find out. But I think the reasons the Secretary of State cannot answer that question are the same as why Bill Clinton was misled in what happened with the deaths of Michael Devine and the husband of Jennifer Harberry. The President had been asking questions for months. The administration wanted to know. The intelligence community simply would not reveal the truth.
Take it from the time that your story, which appeared in the New York Times, in which you disclose a letter to the President about this. What's happened since then? What's been the CIA response? Where are they? What new developments have taken place?
Well, for the briefest of times, the Central Intelligence Agency argued that it did not know when, in fact, Jennifer Harberry's husband was killed, or more details about Michael Devine, and would acknowledge little. But clearly, Bill Clinton must have been outraged, because that story quickly began to unfold. And there was as close to an acknowledgement as you'll ever get out of the intelligence community that, in fact, this Colonel Alperez, who we now know was responsible for both murders, not only was known to the CIA to be a murderer, but in fact was on the payroll. And most startling, almost unbelievably, that months after they knew that he had killed an American citizen, he remained on the CIA payroll and, in fact, was paid, according to the New York Times, $60,000.
Tell me what you have found out, Allen. You've got a story that's in The Nation magazine called CIA Death Squad. Americans have been directly involved in Guatemalan army killings. What can you add to this story before I go to Elliot in Washington?
Alperez is one colonel on the CIA payroll who committed two murders. From talking to both Guatemalan and U.S. operatives involved in this, it's clear that there are many, perhaps dozens of Guatemalan military officers on the CIA payroll who've been involved in thousands of killings. The G2, the Military Intelligence Service, which coordinates the assassinations and disappearances, their top officials have for years been paid by the CIA. I was able to learn the names of three of them who've been on the payroll, as well as General Hector Gramajo, General Roberto Mata, two of the top officers, closest U.S. protégés who've been directly involved in commanding massacres in the Northwest Highlands. Furthermore, there are actual U.S. CIA agents who work directly inside the G2. I was able to learn the names of two of them, Joe Giacarino and Randy Capister. They provide what's called technical assistance and advice. I was able to reach Colonel Alperez on the phone in Guatemala. He denied being involved in the Devine and Bamaka killings, said the CIA wasn't paying him. But he talked rather extensively about how the CIA essentially helps to run the G2 with ongoing advice and American advisors right there inside this systematic killing operation.
You recorded this conversation?
No, I took extensive notes on it, and it's not just the CIA. It's the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House as well. For example, I mean, here are some internal State Department records which indicate that during both the Bush and Clinton administrations, after there was a supposed cutoff of military aid to Guatemala, the State Department authorized at least 114 separate sales of pistols and rifles to Guatemala. The U.S. military has been planning joint maneuvers with the Guatemalan military this spring. I mean, this is an across-the-board policy, and you have to hold the president accountable for that.
Elliot, you were Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs during the Reagan administration. Tell me what you make of this story, what you know about what went on during the Reagan administration, and perhaps what you have learned about this story since it broke?
I may not know as many facts about this as Bob Torricelli does, but from what I can see, there's a lot less here than meets the eye. The fact that the CIA maintains relationships with intelligence people and military people in Central America and throughout the world is not news. The fact that some of them are pretty unattractive people is not news. Whether this colonel is in fact responsible for those murders, I'm not sure. Some people have been convicted for the murder of Mr. Devine, so it's not clear to me that, and he's not one of them, it's not clear to me that he was involved in that. I don't think, on the basis of the facts I know, that the CIA found out about his involvement and sat on it. My information is that they did report it to Washington, at least to the Department of Justice.
Reported it to CIA in Washington. You're saying the bureau chief in Guatemala reported it back to Washington, to Langley?
And it was reported then by the CIA to the Justice Department. Now, that we had an ongoing CIA program in Guatemala at a time when there was a military cutoff, you can't do that without a finding that's got to be approved by the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. So one question to ask is, if the Intelligence Committees didn't like this, why didn't they stop it? I just think that before we start jumping up and down here and saying this is another case of the CIA out of control, here I think I might agree with Mr. Nairn that if this was a Bush and Clinton policy, then let's talk about the policy of the president in both cases, and let's not start talking about a rogue CIA, which does not yet appear to me to exist.
Well, let me just ask you a question, hypothetical. Would you, as a Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, if you found out that our government was paying a man in the Guatemalan military after it learned that he had been implicated, this is a hypothetical, in the assassination of an American or someone married to an American, would you be outraged? If they were paying him after they learned he'd been involved in the murder of Americans or people married to Americans?
I would certainly be outraged in the Devine case, which looks like the cold-blooded murder of an innocent American. The notion that we would continue to employ such a person would give him and others in the Guatemalan military the sense that we just didn't care about the killing of American citizens. The Bamaka case is a different case. That guy was a guerrilla, and he was not an American.
Yeah, but he wasn't killed in battle. He was killed in prison.
No, but it is a different case, and the responsibility that we have is to protect, above all, American citizens, not Guatemalan guerrillas. So it is a different case, different kind of level of seriousness for the U.S. government.
Alan.
Charlie, you asked a hypothetical. How would Mr. Abrams react? In fact, we have this historical record. We can see how he and the other Reagan and Bush and Clinton officials have reacted. And
in the State Department or in the CIA or both?
Across the board. And in the face of this systematic policy of slaughter by the Guatemalan military, more than 110,000 civilians killed by that military since 1978, what Amnesty International has called a government program of political murder, the U.S. has continued to provide covert assistance to the G2. And they have continued, especially during the time of Mr. Abrams, to provide political aid and comfort. For example, during the Northwest Highland massacres of the late 80s, when the Catholic Church said, never in our history has it come to such grave extremes, it has reached the point of genocide. President Reagan went down, embraced Rios Montt, the dictator who was staging these massacres, and said he was getting a bum rap on human rights. In '85, when human rights leader Rosario Godoy was abducted by the Army, raped and mutilated. Her baby had his fingernails torn out. The Guatemalan military said, oh, they died in a traffic accident. The human rights groups contacted Mr. Abrams, asked him about it. He wrote back, this is his letter of reply. He said, yes, there's no evidence other than that they died in a traffic accident.
Elliot,
this is a woman raped and mutilated, a baby with his fingernails torn out. I want to come to Congressman Torricelli. This is long-standing policy.
In a moment, but these are specific points raised by Allen having to do with your
I'll tell you, whatever Allan Nairn wants to do, Charlie, I'm not here to refight the Cold War. I'm glad we won. Maybe he's not. What I'm here to say is we're talking not about U.S. policy in the world.
One against who? One against those civilians the Guatemalan Army was massacring?
Wait a minute. We're not here to refight the Cold War. We're here to talk about, I thought, a specific case in which an allegation is being made that the husband of an American, in another case an American citizen, were killed, and there was a CIA connection with the person allegedly involved in it. Now, I'm happy to talk about that kind of thing. If Mr. Nairn thinks we should have been on the other side in Guatemala, that is, we should have been in favor of a guerrilla victory, I disagree with him.
So you're then admitting that you were on the side of the Guatemalan military?
I am admitting that it was the policy of the United States under Democrats and Republicans, approved by Congress repeatedly, to oppose a communist guerrilla victory anywhere in Central America, including in Guatemala.
A communist guerrilla victory. 95% of these victims are civilians, peasant organizers, human rights leaders, priests, assassinated by the U.S.-backed Guatemalan Army.
I'm happy to invite both of you back to review Reagan and Bush administration policy. Right now, I do want to stick to this point because there seems to be a difference in terms of what you said, Eliot Abrams, and what Robert Torricelli said about the specifics of this in terms of what you think that there's much to be made out of this, too much is being made out of this, and your point, in fact, you have had the most accusatory things to say about the CIA being out of control.
Well, and in fairness, Elliot, I think there are some nuances to some of these points of which he may not be aware. When Michael Devine was killed, soon thereafter, the Central Intelligence Agency had information that he was implicated in, if not the direct death, they at least knew right away in the cover-up of it. Months later, he continued on the payroll. When they learned that he was directly responsible for his death, they decided to terminate the payments. But they met with him, paid him an additional $60,000, made a judgment not to refer this to prosecutorial authorities. And although they may or may not have made payments after that...
Prosecutorial authorities in Guatemala or...
Or to inform the Justice Department at that point or the Guatemalan government. They did maintain a relationship with him after that point. This is in the death of an American. Now, there's an additional credibility problem for the United States government that goes beyond policy. In a proud moment of the Bush administration, the Secretary of State comes forward and announces we are going to suspend aid to Guatemala because they have not solved the Michael Devine murder. And the Congress was indeed very pleased. Now we discover, last week, that the Central Intelligence Agency, in a covert program, dollar for dollar, replaced the public aid of the United States government to Guatemala with its own covert foreign aid
program. With the knowledge of the State Department?
It is not clear. And the Secretary of State of the United States still cannot answer that question.
With the knowledge of the intelligence committees? I mean, wasn't there a finding for
the Oversight Committee in the Congress? Did they not know?
Members of the Intelligence Committee tell me they did not know. And, Elliot, what's important is your successor, Bernie Aronson, who was administering American policy to Latin America,
who was a Democrat when appointed by the Bush administration.
Was a Democrat, but appointed by the Bush administration, did not know, and the American ambassador to Guatemala did not know. The State Department was maintaining a public policy. The Congress was told a policy. We don't know whether or not President Bush even knew that his own policy was being subverted by the intelligence community.
Bob, you know
wait 1 second. I'll come right back to you. Go ahead, Elliot.
Well, the head of the CIA in those days, if I recall correctly, was Judge William Webster, one of the most cautious and prudent men that's ever run the CIA. If what you're saying is true, Bob, if it's exactly right, then you had an operation here which was being concealed from Congress and the State Department. I would find it, maybe it's true, in which case it really is scandalous, but I'm going to wait until I find out that it is true, because my experience is that there are a lot of people who conveniently say they didn't know what the CIA was doing. For example, in the case of mining the harbors in Nicaragua, where a lot of people on the Hill forgot what they were told. So maybe some people in the intelligence committees now all of a sudden have a memory lapse, and maybe some people in the State Department do. It's a fact question. I can't answer it.
It's a fact question, Elliot, and either alternative, however, is extraordinarily troubling.
Yes.
Either, A, the United States government was maintaining a point of principle that was canceling aid and George Bush signed a finding to allow it to go on covertly when he was taking credit for canceling it. There's one problem. Or alternatively, George Bush thought he was canceling it, and the Central Intelligence Agency had its own foreign policy and subverted the president's policy. Like Elliot, I don't know which one it was.
You were saying, Elliot, even that you'd be surprised if that was true, and it would be scandalous if it was.
Absolutely.
It's one of the two.
Right.
And let's look at reality here. In reality, we're not talking about 2 murders, 1 colonel. We're talking about more than 100,000 murders, an entire army, many of its top officers, employees of the U.S. Government. We're talking about crimes, and we're also talking about criminals, not just people like the Guatemalan colonels, but also the U.S. agents who've been working with them, and the higher-level U.S. officials. I mean, I think you have to apply uniform standards. President Bush once talked about putting Saddam Hussein on trial for crimes against humanity, Nuremberg-style tribunal. I think that's a good idea. But if you're serious, you have to be even-handed. If we look at a case like this, I think we have to start talking about putting Guatemalan and U.S. officials on trial. I think someone like Mr. Abrams would be a fit subject for such a Nuremberg-style inquiry. But I agree with Mr. Abrams that Democrats would have to be in the dock with him. The Congress has been in on this. The Congress approved the sale of 16,000 M16s to Guatemala. In 87 and 88,
hold on one second. Before, because
they voted more military aid than the Republicans asked for.
Again, I invite you and Elliot Abrams back to discuss what he did. But right
thanks,
now,
Charlie, but I
hold on one second, Elliot. Go ahead. You want to repeat the question of you want to be in the dock?
It is ludicrous to respond to that kind of stupidity. This guy thinks we were on the wrong side in the Cold War. Maybe he personally was on the wrong side. I am one of the many millions of Americans who
Mr.
think
Abrams, you were on
happy
the wrong side in supporting the massacre of peasants and organizers.
What I want to do is
I
want to ask the following
Absolutely,
question.
and that's a crime. That's a crime, Mr. Abrams, for which people should be tried.
You have read this
right. We'll put all the American officials who won the Cold War in the dock.
All right. You have read this article.
I have read the article.
Yeah. Did you find anything that your information contradicts in this article by Allan Nairn in The Nation magazine? You have said it's the talk of Washington, this article.
Every day this story has surpassed expectations of the day before, even in Washington, where people tend to be cynical on these things. What this article suggests to us is rather than a few Guatemalan military officers who've abused rights, that indeed the entire military leadership of Guatemala may be rife with U.S. informants.
And also that there are disturbing connections between American agents in Guatemala and the activities of what can be called nothing more than killer squads. Yes?
Yes, correct.
There's death squad activity in which the intelligence communities of the United States have been deeply involved. I don't want to get into this debate about the Guatemalan Civil War. I only want to say this, that the United States had no role in being this deeply involved in the Guatemalan military, being this involved in these death squad activities. There was no effort to separate ourselves. I think when all is said and done, we're going to find that there have been rogue operations within the United States intelligence community, outside of the control of even the Director of Central Intelligence. Guatemala has been handled as a backwater of the intelligence community of the United States, its own private preserve.
For what objective?
I think we're headed for some very startling weeks ahead.
To learn what? I mean, tell me what it is that was at stake here and what is going to be so startling that might be discovered. Give me a preview of what you think is around the corner.
I think that there were operations of the intelligence community, of individuals in that community, that were engaged in activities beyond the policies and the scope of the United States government for a variety of purposes. That's as much as I'm going to say. But I think we're headed here for some startling revelations.
Without naming names, what kinds of activities?
I think there were a variety of illegal activities taking place.
This is more than giving money to people who are going out killing Americans or spouses of Americans. You're talking about Americans who you believe might have been, in some cases, involved in committing the acts themselves?
I don't believe that the likes of a Webster or a Gates or a Woolsey, directors of the Central Intelligence Agency, would be condoning or even knowledgeable of the kinds of activities that we're now hearing about occurred in Guatemala.
I assume you would agree with that, Elliot.
Well,
that all
we'll
this
find
could
out.
take
Let's say
place
if they were
without
not
it being
aware,
reported up the line to the director.
If all of this happened and none of them were aware, one has to say what kind of managers were they. I would urge Bob Torricelli to stick to the facts and to avoid the kind of crackpot theories that we're getting from Mr. Nairn. If you stick to the facts, there may be quite enough to get people's attention.
Well,
yeah, but I also have to say that Allan Nairn is a distinguished reporter who won the George Polk Award last year. So, I mean, you know, I don't want him characterized on this broadcast as a crackpot. I mean,
well,
you can have a personal argument about what he says about you specifically, but go ahead.
When a guy tells me that he thinks that the entire American leadership during the Cold War needs to have a Nuremberg trial, he's a crackpot.
Okay, I mean, I would...
Well,
point well taken.
It's Mr. Abrams' right to say whatever he wants, but the facts speak for themselves. And in the case of Guatemala, you have this ongoing pattern of murder, which has been public record. The Catholic Church in Guatemala has documented it. All the human rights groups have documented it. And on the public level, not even talking about the covert level, year after year, the U.S. Has continued to provide all different kinds of aid to the Guatemalan military. Right now, it's the Clinton administration that's talking about a joint maneuver with the Guatemalan army. It's the State Department that was licensing these 114 pistol and rifle sales. The idea of a rogue operation is really preposterous when you have this kind of systematic, ongoing program that stretches back over years, over both Democratic and Republican administrations.
I got one last question, Robert Torricelli. I think you know this better than anyone else. One, what's happened to Colonel Alvarez?
Colonel Alvarez remains in the Guatemalan military. He is claiming that he never received payments from the United States.
To Allen in a phone conversation.
He's threatening libel suits. I suggested he come to the United States under oath with threat of perjury, or write to the State Department and ask that his file be released.
And what's the...
In fact, the question of whether he received payments is not seriously debated in Washington. Charlie, what I think people should know, though, of real concern about this is this debate that we're having here may never be settled. As you know, we have had informants now from the National Security Agency that have written to me, communicated with other news media in Washington.
On NSA stationery.
On NSA stationery, that the files and computer records regarding Army and CIA activities in Guatemala this week were being systematically destroyed. So whether or not there was knowledge, whether or not the activities I'm suggesting might have occurred, the fact is we may never know, and therefore never learn any lessons about civilian control of the CIA.
Any fear you're out on too far on a limb on this?
From the day this began, I was afraid I was too far out on a limb, and every day I wake up to find the limb has moved way out beyond me. This is moving very quickly. But I am aware of the fact that, given the sources we now have, that the evidence may be destroyed, and we may never know.
Yeah. Robert Torricelli, Congressman of the United States from New Jersey, a Democrat. Allan Nairn from Nation magazine. Eliot Abrams, former Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs in the Reagan administration. Thank you very much. Pleasure. Last word to you, Eliot. Anything you want to add to this?
I would just
Since you're in Washington.
I would just urge Bob Torricelli again. The facts may be dynamic enough. Let's just all stick to the facts and go no further than they take us.
And this is mass murder. This country should not be supporting it. If Americans knew about it, they wouldn't stand for it.
All right. Thank you all. We'll be right back. Frank Israel is here. He is a terrific architect from Los Angeles, and we'll talk about his work and his ideas about architect. He's been associated with some of the great architects in America. Back in a moment. Stay with us. Frank Israel is here. He's one of our most innovative architects. He lives in Los Angeles now. Many of his clients from Los Angeles in the entertainment community. He has a special relationship to clients. We'll talk about that. He has also been associated in one way or the other with some of the great names in American architecture. I am pleased to have Frank Israel here. We'll look at some of his work and talk about some of his clients and talk about the city of Los Angeles. But first, let me introduce you to Frank Israel. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me to be here.
It's a pleasure. You actually grew up in New Jersey, yes?
Yes. Yeah. I was born in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And then when I was 1 year old, I moved to Elizabeth, New Jersey. And that's where I spent most of my childhood through high school.
Yeah. There was an interesting story about Aaron Copland, who I once made a documentary about, where you were sort of an assistant in one summer or something. And
yeah, I worked for him one summer in Tanglewood. I was actually going to camp in the Berkshires, And they were scouring the camp one day for assistance to help the great impresarios at Tanglewood, and he was one of them. And I got caught in the stream, and I spent half of the summer running around and getting him iced tea and bringing him sandwiches and listening to his music, which I knew nothing about at the time, and I became mesmerized by it. And had a very, very strong effect on me.
The rodeo and all the things, Billy.
My claim to fame was that I could whistle the Third Symphony complete.
When did you know, I have a feeling that architecture might be something that...
Well, you know, it was interesting growing up in the suburbs, because at the time that I grew up in the suburbs, they were building all these extraordinary ranch houses. You know, the ranch house evolved. It was something that came from California, actually. And I was tantalized by all of these buildings going up all over the neighborhood or throughout the neighborhood that I lived in, as well as further out where my cousins were living up in northern New Jersey. And I found myself making believe that I was an architect and drawing up plans and getting involved with developing interiors. And then shortly after that, I became interested in theater, too. So there was a kind of a juxtaposition between an interest in theater and an interest in architecture. Most of the interest in theater had to do with sets, and I built these little theaters and concocted sets and put on operas for my friends.
Little did you know that later on you would be designing sets in Los Angeles.
Exactly.
Let me stay. You went to Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania.
Yes, that's where I went as an undergraduate.
And Louis Kahn was there?
Louis Kahn was there. And
I mean, this is, some people think, the best architect that America has produced.
Oh, absolutely. And I had never heard of Louis Kahn when I was a freshman in college. I arrived and I was in my dormitory looking out at a very strange building, which was called the Richards Medical Research Building, which was the first building that Kahn designed on the University of Pennsylvania campus. And I was shocked by it because it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. About a week later, I wandered into the architecture building just out of interest, and I saw this gray-haired, short man in his probably late 60s, early 70s, teaching a class. And I sat down and listened, and I found myself sitting there for hours and coming back day after day, and it was Lou Kahn. Eventually, I had the opportunity to work for him one summer, and the job consisted of me sharpening mat knife blades for models that they were building of a huge project that he was designing in India.
Robert Venturi, who wrote Contradict, what was it, Complexity
He wrote
and
Complexity
Contradiction in
and
Architecture?
Contradiction, yes. I met Bob when I was in my last year at Penn, and it was when I was trying to decide where to go to architecture school, whether I should stay in Philadelphia or go somewhere else, and I decided to transfer to Yale, and that was because of Bob. Bob and Denise were doing a studio at Yale called Learning from Las Vegas, and I found the premise of that studio fascinating and decided that I wanted to go to Yale and be a member of that studio with Bob and Denise. It actually didn't happen that way, but I was around them, and I was around the students who were in that studio, and it had a very profound effect on the way I looked at urbanism.
You didn't stay at Yale very long, did you?
No.
You know, you came back to New York City, did you?
Yeah, I transferred eventually to Columbia.
And there you met Bob Stern.
Mm-hmm. I met, I knew Romaldo Giurgola, who had become the dean of Columbia from Philadelphia. And I met Bob Stern about the second year that I was at Columbia, and I worked for Bob one summer. And he had a very strong effect on me, as he does most of his students.
In what way?
Well, Bob's an interesting guy. You know, he has very strong opinions, and he likes to bounce his opinions off on his students. And I found that the opportunity to work with Bob, on the one hand, made me become more, you might say, more sure of myself as an architect. Bob has a very distinct way of working, and it has a very distinct philosophy of design, which I don't necessarily agree with at this point. But at the time that I was a student working for him, I found it very interesting, and I found it something that kept me alert and kept me on my toes.
He also was instrumental in you getting the Rome Prize, I guess.
Yes, yes. And in fact, last night I gave a talk at the American Academy in Rome which Adele Chatfield-Taylor wanted me to plug in the show when she heard I was going to be on the show.
She's a master at that.
And I thanked Bob Stern, and I thanked Harry Cobb, who's IMPA's partner, and I thanked Philip Johnson because they were all on my jury, and they awarded me the Rome Prize 20 years ago.
What interests me is what influence on your development as an architect did your time spent in Europe do? What impact, what consequence, what influence?
Well, the thing that I got involved with when I went to Rome was I started reading Henry James, and that was partially due to Bob. Bob Stern had been interested in Henry James. There's a lot of Jamesian in his work. And the opportunity to read and discover the effect that a European experience has on an American was something that was embedded in James's work. And I found that at the time that I was living in Rome, the dollar was very good, so you could in fact travel a lot and live quite well. But there was still a sense of being somewhat naive compared to many of the people I was surrounded by who were Europeans. Yeah. And I think that naivete provoked me to do certain projects and look at things in a way that a more sophisticated European was not capable of doing.
Because of time, I'm going to skip through some things that interest me, and I wish I had more time, and I hope I will. But you also work with Robert Meyer, with Richard Meyer, and you work with Jack Robinson on a project that I guess was abandoned because the Shaw was abandoned.
Yeah, I worked for Jack for a couple of years in Tehran and London.
You got to L.A. And to teach at UCLA in the end. And Frank Gehry. Tell me what influence Gehry has had on you. He's been on this broadcast 3 or 4 times.
I know. I've seen the shows.
What influence has he had on you before we talk about Los Angeles and clients and see your work?
Well, the thing about Frank, which was interesting, was like anyone who's really good, and I experienced this when I saw the house that Bob Venturi designed for his mother, which I think changed the course of American architecture, as much as the house that Frank Gehry designed for himself and his wife and family in Los Angeles, is that it was work that demanded a person or the viewer to carefully scrutinize it. It's not easy work. It's not immediately beautiful. Parts of it are ugly, and parts of it are difficult to deal with, difficult to accept, but challenging just the same, because they challenge your sensibilities. And what was so important to me about Frank's work, and still is his ability to understand how to build in the city today. That in order to build in the city today, one has to recognize the juxtapositions of different styles, different materials, different scales, as well as different programs. We don't live in cities that are designed in a very common way in which all the buildings look the same, all the buildings are the same height and made of the same materials. Instead, we live in a city which celebrates, and I mean that about New York, and I mean that about Los Angeles, that celebrates pluralism. And I think Frank's work is very much about pluralism. It's very much about juxtaposition. And it demands that the viewer and the user understand this and celebrate it.
Also about annexation. Los Angeles. You were encouraged to go to Los Angeles, and I know Philip Johnson has said that he thinks that it's a hot architectural center now. What is being there in that place with how does that influence you as an architect in terms of ideas, in terms of opportunities, in terms of who you have become, as a creative artist?
Well, actually, Philip was the one who sent me to Los Angeles. I had finished working on a Tehran project with Jack. It was dead, unfortunately. And I was anxious, and I spoke with Philip, and he basically told me I should go to L.A. It was the only place where there was anything happening at the time, and this was in the late 70s, early 80s. So I moved off to L.A. and had the opportunity to teach at UCLA because of my friendship with Charles Moore, who was the dean at the time. And what struck me initially about L.A. was that there were unlimited possibilities there in the building industry. One, because of the weather. It's much easier to build in L.A. than it is, let's say, in New York. But more importantly, because of the clients that I met And most of the clients I met through my initial involvement in the film industry. I took a job because I was interested in learning about special effects in film design, and I took a job working for a gentleman named Bob Abel. And for some reason, the most talented people in LA were working in his studio at the time. And I met them and I worked with them, and eventually many of these men and women became clients of mine because I never gave up architecture. I continued to teach and I was working part-time.
Designing sets?
Yes. Yeah. And actually special effects, which are very different. I was working on TV commercials and one film project, and then I got whisked away and worked in the Philippines for about 6 months on a Roger Vadim movie.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Let me show some things.
Which was kind of interesting.
Yeah. What was the movie?
It was called Night Games. It was with Joanna Cassidy.
Tell me about, I want to just show, this is the Goldberg Bean residence. Talk about this, and I'm going to hold it up so this camera will be able to see it.
This is an interesting project because it actually shows...
It reflects some of the things we've been talking
about. Yeah, it shows the influence of Venturi in some cases. Venturi did a house in Connecticut for the Brandt family, and this piece actually is reminiscent of that. But more importantly, the materials, the use of metal. This is a type of bonderized sheet metal and exposed redwood, and stucco came very much from Frank Gehry and his interest in using different materials
to look at this. I just find this express
different parts of a building. But there's something else here, and it came out last night when Herbert Mouchamp was introducing my talk, and he talked about the influence of California modernism on my work, specifically the architects Schindler, Neutra, and Frank Lloyd Wright. And there are elements, certainly these horizontal mullions and corner windows that you see in the work that can't come directly from Frank Lloyd Wright and Rudolf Schindler. And these were the great modernists who came to Los Angeles in the 30s and started a new architecture. And it's an architecture that got dropped for a while, but I think in the work that we've been doing, as well as some of my contemporaries in LA, we're attempting to perpetuate that myth of modernism at the moment.
You have said a number of times that you are a stylist and not an originator. Mm-hmm. What do you mean?
Well, I think it gets back to what I just said about Schindler and Wright. I like to see myself as someone who's taken a baton of modernism, which has been passed to me by these founding fathers, and I'm taking it further, and I'm taking it in a new direction, and I'm trying to build these buildings well. You see that modernists were experimenting with materials and techniques, and that explains why so many of their buildings are not built well, and why so many people, the public in general, find their buildings somewhat abrasive. And I find that as an architect, with the people I work in my office, we are very much involved with trying to perpetuate modernism, but understand how to build buildings so that they last, so that they're durable, and also comfortable.
Speaking of durable, this was built. This is called the Wu Fang Pavilion. Tell me about that.
Well, that was built for Mike Wu and Susan Fong,
who ran for mayor, didn't he?
Yes, Mike ran for mayor. We were building this building at the time that he was running for mayor. It was also built during the earthquake last year, so it's a building that has a sort of earthquake image to it. It was written about by Suzanne Stevens last year as having that kind of earthquake
I want to get through
aesthetic.
Some of these just to give an opportunity.
This is a project that I did in Japan. It's in an area in northern Tokyo. And the idea of this project is to celebrate landscape. You know, there isn't very much open space in Tokyo, and what this project does is it creates a series of roof terraces. These are all terraces which become parks with playing fields and places to play with your children and contemplate the sky.
Okay, Virgin Records, you've done this for...
This is a Virgin Records project. We did this for Richard Bramson and Jeff Aroff and Jordan, his partner.
Again, we see what another notion that you have called, which is the love of violated geometry. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Yes.
You know, and color, you know, and emptiness and space. I want to show a couple more things, then I got a couple more conversations. This is Steve Tisch, who was involved with producing Forrest Gump, just won an Oscar. This is his office.
Yes, that's actually the doorway leading into his office. Which
a lot of emptiness there.
Yeah, he wanted it to feel almost like a set from a German expressionist film.
Yeah. Speaking of the role of an architect and the role of the client, there has developed in the 80s, certainly, the notion of signature architecture, in which architects became stars, and their work was, in a sense, called works of art, and you sort of forgot one thing, is that the patron, the person who wanted that piece of art, tell me how you feel about this relationship between an architect and his client who wants the building.
Well, I think probably the best experience I had in terms of dealing with someone like that was Frederick Wiseman, who passed away last year. He's an art collector, but he's known more importantly as being the owner of Hunt Foods, and he was married to Marcia Simon, who was Norton Simon's sister. And Fred prided himself on being a patron of the arts and of architecture, and he hired Frank Gehry early in his career to do several projects. And eventually I met Fred through Frank Gehry and had an opportunity to do a couple of projects for him. And his patronage actually was fairly widespread. He was a very opinionated man. He had very strong opinions about this building I designed for him, and there were things that I had to change as a result of those opinions. And there were also things that I designed according to his particular likes
my
and
guess
dislikes.
is that you, as in being the way you are, like an engaged client.
Oh,
that
yeah,
makes
I
your
do.
work come out.
See, it's not, I have a lot of respect for Richard Meyer. Richard has once said that the best client for him is someone who comes, signs the contract, and then goes away. And then he comes back with the building. And I actually differ from Richard on that. I like a client who's engaged, who has opinions, who enjoys dialogue. I enjoy a good argument, if it's an intellectual argument. And I also like the involvement of other people. The people I have working for me in my office get extremely involved in the work and how it develops. And I find that that's how you create exciting architecture. That's how you become someone who understands siting a building and how to site a building in a particular place in a city.
What pleases you most about the direction of architecture, and what do you dislike most about architecture today?
Well, what pleases me about the direction of architecture, especially in Los Angeles, and much more so there than what I see here in New York, is the experimentation that's going on. We have a tremendous amount of talent in LA. I wish there was more work. And the city invites talented young architects to experiment with their ideas, not in necessarily large ways, but certainly in many small ways. And you drive around the city and you see things that are pretty amazing.
Is this why Herbert Mouchon in a piece called you a flirt? Because your sense of wanting to, you had an integrity about your work, but at the same time you wanted to brush up against and flirt with ideas.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Definitely like to flirt with ideas. And I'm one who gets bored quickly. So what's important for me is to test new ideas and attempt to do things and take risks. I like to do that.
I have mentioned some of the biggest names in architecture that you have been associated with, from known or had brushed up against, from Louis Kahn and Robert Venturi and Richard Meyer and Frank Gehry and others, Schindler, and people that have from world of creativity who've influenced you. What would you like to believe your contribution has been?
Well, it's interesting because people keep telling me that they're seeing buildings going up around the city that resemble my architecture, which seems to say that people are looking at the work or looking at the books. And that's gratifying. But I think more importantly, at this point, the work that I am doing and the interests that I have, it has more to do with, and this may seem to come from left field to you, has more to do with an importance and an emphasis on landscape and how buildings sit within the land. Because what we've done over the years is we've rejected that as a basis for starting an architectural design or developing a particular set of principles. And the work that I'm doing now is very much about siting and about buildings which are integral to their particular place, not in a stylistic way, but more in an abstract one.
It's a pleasure to meet you, and I thank you for joining us on this program.
Thank you,
very much. Frank Israel, 2 books here, Franklin D. Israel in Beverly Hills. His firm is located. When we come back, we'll talk about this weekend's Final Four. Jim Nantz, CBS Sports. Stay with us. The NCAA tournament is down to the Final Four. This Saturday, we'll see Oklahoma State versus UCLA and North Carolina versus Arkansas in a bid for the finals. Jim Nantz, the voice of CBS Sports college basketball coverage and golf, joins us now from Seattle, the site of the Final Four. Jim, great to have you here. Thanks for coming, or not here, but thank you for sharing your time on this broadcast as we look to Saturday's games.
Well, Charlie, I can't wait for the games to get here, but it's always a pleasure this time of year to be able to visit with you.
Yes.
And I know that you're not in Seattle, but your heart is.
Yes, indeed.
With the Carolina Tar Heels.
Why didn't I get to be the runner this year? I mean, did Packer talk you out of allowing me to be there? I mean, Packer has not stopped complaining about the fact that I was more interested in the game than I was in getting him one more cup of coffee.
Well, we go back to '93 when you fulfilled the duties of the CBS
I was your
celebrity runner.
Right.
And, you know, the one thing we asked you to do was to make sure Billy had a hot cup of coffee.
Yeah.
And you disappeared for like a half.
That's right.
And came back and gave him this ice-cold coffee. And he hasn't gotten over it yet,
Has he
Charlie.
vetoed me every time since then?
No,
Who's doing it this year?
Well, this year it's a buddy of mine named John Ashworth, who has his own golf apparel company. That's you know, he's doing great, and he's been talking about.
Did John provide that little shirt you have on?
No, no. In fact, hopefully, though, after this weekend, there will be a few. No, all
right.
John's an old friend, and you know, it is a tradition. We change it every year.
Yeah.
Last year, we had one of the guys from Pearl Jam as our celebrity runner. Charlie Rose in '93, Fred Couples in '92.
All right, let's talk about the game. Size up what you think about the matches on Saturday.
I think Saturday, what we have here is we have a classic game in Game 2, Arkansas, North Carolina, and that's a game to me that is destined for a last-minute finish. In the first game, we have a game that to me is being completely overlooked for some reason. UCLA has just been given like a bye into Monday night if you talk to most people. And believe me, the kids that play in the game pick up on all of these vibes. I think it's a very dangerous situation for the Bruins right now, and something that Jim Herrick's going to have to combat before the tip-off tomorrow, because everyone's talking up UCLA. Who will UCLA play? Will it be Carolina? How will they do against Arkansas? Hey, wait a minute. They got to play Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State in the last couple of weeks beat Kansas when it was ranked #1, beat Wake Forest, which won the ACC, beat UMass, which won the A-10 tournament in regular season and was ranked #1 for a good part of the season. So that's going to be a neat contrast in styles, but emotionally, I'm going to give the edge in that game right now to Oklahoma State.
Yeah. How good is Bryant Reeves?
I think he's really good. I've seen a lot of him, even back to his freshman year, and the kid has worked so hard to turn himself into, you know, a dominating big man, and he's going to have a future beyond this year in basketball. He'll be playing in the pros. But, you know, one strength coach described Bryant Reeves when he came out of Little Gans, Oklahoma, right there on the Oklahoma-Arkansas border, as a guy that when he first grabbed him by the biceps when he was a freshman, it felt like grabbing a little old lady's arm. He couldn't even bench press 100 pounds. And, you know, he said he's 290 pounds of blubber. But, you know, Bryant Reeves hit the weights, worked harder than Eddie Sutton has seen anyone work in all of his 25 years of coaching. And, you know, he's going to be a big force in this tournament.
Eddie Sutton might be a factor, too. He's a good coach and has been
They're
around
all good,
and knows the pressure.
Yeah. Well, all these four coaches, you know, I mean, all of them have experienced pressure, have had to beat back critics, even Dean Smith. You know, you've heard it through the years, Charlie. For some reason, you know, no matter what Dean accomplishes, it's just not good enough for a lot of people, and it's crazy. You know, he's in 34 years of coaching, 10 Final Fours. And I don't need to even give you his whole resume. He's a legend.
So size up that game between Carolina and Arkansas, Dean Smith versus Nolan Richardson?
Well, you know, to me, Arkansas is the team to beat here. Arkansas comes in with, you know, a national championship ring. Everyone who participated in that game essentially a year ago when they won the title was back on the floor. I know they've had some close calls, but they've learned how to survive and advance. And, you know, I think Nolan feels that he's often overlooked by the media and by the fans as one of the best coaches in college basketball.
But doesn't he use that? I mean, I remember when they beat my beloved Blue Devils. The idea that he promoted down in Charlotte was this notion that we're not taken seriously, we're really good. And he had his players whipped up, in a sense, motivated by the fact they don't respect us. Let's go show them.
Charlie, he's bringing back that same mantra this year. He's getting right back into it. And you know what? I think maybe this year it's a little justified. I mean, you're talking about the national champions, and here in Seattle, no one's even talking about them. It's all UCLA, and then it's North Carolina. And, you know, Arkansas should, in my estimation, be getting more build-up, being pumped up a little bit more before the Final Four. But you look at who Nolan has beaten in the last 2 years of the tournament. Last year he beat John Thompson, Steve Fisher, and Lute Olson and Mike Krzyzewski. This year he's beaten Jim Boeheim, Jeff Jones, one of the brilliant young minds in college basketball, and now faces Dean Smith. So he's been able to march right through these teams and other coaches, and I think I think he's one of the best.
My pick is Carolina because of Dean Smith and also because of Stackhouse and Wallace, and because they showed against Kentucky how good they can be.
Well, they shut down Kentucky to a season low, 28% from the field. And if there is something you can tie all of the regional finals together by, it's field goal percentage defense. I don't want to get too statistical here, but Carolina shut down Kentucky 28%, season low. Oklahoma State shut down UMass in the 20s, season low. Arkansas shut down Virginia 33%, which was a season low. And UCLA was the top field goal percentage defense team in the whole Pac-10. So after all of the hoopla and all the slam dunks and fast breaks and all of that, really what we're saying is it all gets down to which team, once it bad enough on defense, is going to win here in Seattle.
Who is Packer predicting?
Billy, you know, Billy won't make predictions. Ever since he got a cold cup of coffee, he's quit making predictions. I think that, you know, I don't even want to try to read his mind. I am sensing that he's got UCLA and Carolina in the final on Monday night, but he probably wouldn't want to hear that.
How about you?
I'm going to stick with Arkansas only because I made that prediction before the season or before the tournament started. And, you know, I still think Friday night is a too close to call kind of a game. I mean, I think it's a last possession game. And as a broadcaster, I got my fingers crossed. I hope it is. On the other side of the bracket, I really look at Oklahoma State, UCLA as a toss-up. I mean, again, everybody is assuming UCLA is going to be playing on Monday night. And I think emotion plays such a big part at this point that Oklahoma State's got to be hearing all this talk. And they've got 4 seniors in the starting lineup. And believe me, they want it more than anybody here.
Is there, among the sports writers you've talked to in Seattle, a consensus choice?
UCLA. Yeah,
UCLA.
Again, everybody's talking UCLA. It's just hands down UCLA.
Jim Nantz, thank you for joining us. A pleasure to have you on the broadcast. Come by anytime. We'll talk about golf before you go down to the Masters. You
know, Charlie, next year Final Four's coming to the New York area, so we'll have to talk a little bit. I'll get with Billy, and we'll see if we can get you back in as a runner.
I'll caddy 18 holes if you let me be there.
Well, we'll play golf, and we'll talk about it.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Charlie.
Jim Nantz from Seattle, site of the Final Four, as March Madness comes to its end. My thanks to Jim Nantz and CBS Sports for that conversation recorded earlier. Also, Tony Schwartz, you may have read, was going to be on this broadcast. He's written a book called What Really Matters, Searching for Wisdom in America. Tony will be joining us next week. We look forward to seeing you next week. See you then.